You check your phone at the party, not because anyone texted you, not because anything urgent is happening. You check it because your hand needs something to do while the rest of your body figures out how to leave. You showed up 40 minutes ago. You told yourself you would stay for at least an hour, maybe 2, because this time would be different. You put on the right clothes, practiced a few conversation starters in your head on the drive over, and walked through the door with something that almost resembled enthusiasm. And for about 15 minutes, it worked. You talked to someone near the drinks. You laughed at the right moment. You asked a follow-up question that made you seem interested, and you were interested genuinely for that brief window where your body still felt like it belonged in the room. But then something shifted. You could not tell exactly when it happened or what caused it, but the room started to feel louder than it should. The conversations around you became a wall of noise rather than individual threads you could follow. Your chest tightened, just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for you to feel the first wave of that familiar restlessness. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet calculation began. How long have I been here? Is it too early to leave? What excuse would sound believable? You have done this before. You have done this so many times that you have a catalogue of exits. The early morning, the headache, the dog that needs to be let out, the text from a friend who needs you. You have used all of them, rotated through them carefully, so no single excuse gets overplayed. And the strangest part is that you do not even feel like you are lying. Exactly, because by the time you say the words, your body has already made the decision for you. You are just narrating what your nervous system already knows. Here is what you might not realize. The version of you standing at that party, scanning for exits while smiling at a stranger, and the version of you who planned your departure before you even arrived, who chose your outfit with one eye on comfort and the other on how quickly you could get to your car, those are not two different people. They are the same person running the same program. And that program was written a very long time ago, in a language your conscious mind does not speak, but your body remembers perfectly. This is a story about what happens in the space between wanting to connect and needing to escape, about the person who genuinely wants to be the kind of person who stays, who lingers, who is the last one dancing, but whose body keeps overriding that desire with something older and louder and harder to argue with. It is about the nervous system and what it learned about rooms full of people before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. And it is about the possibility, real but not simple, that the pattern can change. But we need to start with the body, because the body decided you were leaving long before you reached for your phone. You know the ritual before the party, not the getting ready part, although that has its own particular tension. The ritual that happens in your mind, sometimes days before, sometimes from the moment you say yes to the invitation. It starts with the yes itself, which often feels like a promise you are already regretting. You said yes because you want to go, because the part of you that craves connection spoke up before the part that fears it could object. And in the moment of saying yes, you felt a brief flash of something like hope. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time you will walk in and feel at ease. Maybe this time You will be the person you imagine yourself being when you imagine yourself at parties, relaxed and warm, and genuinely enjoying the company of other people. But between the yes and the event, the negotiation begins. Your mind starts running scenarios. Who will be there? What you will talk about? How long you will need to stay before leaving is socially acceptable. You rehearse openers. You prepare topics. You think about what to wear. And the clothing decision is never just about aesthetics. It is about armor. What makes you feel protected? What allows for quick departure? Comfortable shoes, because you might need to walk fast to your car. A jacket you can grab easily. Your phone fully charged, because the phone is your lifeline, your excuse generator, your portal to a world where you are safely alone. On the drive there, your body is already doing things your mind is pretending not to notice. Your grip on the steering wheel is tighter than it needs to be. Your jaw is set. Your breathing has shifted to the upper chest, shallow and quick, the kind of breathing that accompanies sympathetic activation. And there is a specific moment, usually when you are about 5 minutes away, when your body offers you a clear, physical vote to turn around. A wave of something that is not quite nausea, but lives in the same neighborhood. A heaviness in the chest. The sudden, vivid attractiveness of your couch, your pajamas, your quiet evening alone. You have to override this vote deliberately, consciously, to keep driving forward. And the act of overriding it costs something. It costs a little piece of the energy reserves you will need once you arrive. The arrival itself is its own event. You park. You sit for a moment. Maybe you check your phone one last time, scrolling through nothing in particular, delaying the transition from the safety of the car to the exposure of the gathering. Then you walk in, and in the first 3 seconds, your nervous system conducts a comprehensive threat assessment that would put any security agency to shame. It registers the volume of the room, the number of people, the layout, specifically the exits, the lighting, the faces of the people nearest the door, and whether any of them are looking at you. All of this happens beneath conscious thought, in the subcortical regions that process environmental stimuli faster than the neocortex can analyze them. And for a while, you are fine. This is the confusing part. Because you are not always a wreck at parties, there are windows, especially early on, where your ventral vagal system is still engaged, where your social skills are online and functioning beautifully, where you can carry a conversation and even enjoy it. You might look, from the outside, like someone who's having a perfectly good time. And you are, in those moments. The problem is that these moments have an expiration date that you cannot predict and cannot control. The window starts closing, and you do not know it is closing until it has already closed. There is a concept in neuroscience called Neuroception, and it was introduced by a researcher named Stephen Porges. What Neuroception describes is something that happens beneath conscious awareness, beneath thought, beneath the stories you tell yourself about why you do what you do. It is your nervous system's continuous, automatic scanning of your environment for signals of safety or danger. And the critical thing to understand is that this scanning happens faster than cognition. Before your brain has time to assess a room and decide whether you are safe, your autonomic nervous system has already made that call and begun adjusting your body accordingly. Porges developed what is now called Polyvagal Theory, which maps 3 distinct states your nervous system can occupy. The first is the ventral vagal state, which is the state of safety and social engagement. When you are in this state, your facial muscles are relaxed, your voice has warmth and melody, your eyes make easy contact, and conversation feels natural. This is the state you were in during those first 15 minutes at the party, when everything still felt manageable. The second state is the sympathetic state, which is fight or flight. Heart rate increases, breath becomes shallow, muscles tense, your visual field narrows, and your hearing shifts away from human voice frequencies toward lower-pitched sounds that signal danger. You do not look relaxed anymore. You start scanning the room, not for friends, but for exits. Your responses get shorter. Your laugh gets thinner. The third state is dorsal vagal, which is shut down. This is the freeze response, the collapse, the numbness. In extreme cases, it looks like dissociation. In a party context, it looks like zoning out mid-conversation, feeling suddenly exhausted, wanting to sit down and not talk to anyone, telling yourself you are just tired, that you had a long day, that you are not really a social person. What Porges discovered is that these states operate in a hierarchy. When the ventral vagal system detects safety, you can engage socially. But when neuroception detects threat, even subtle, ambiguous threat that your conscious mind would dismiss as harmless, the nervous system drops down the hierarchy. First to sympathetic activation, where you become mobilized. Then, if the perceived threat continues or intensifies, to dorsal vagal shutdown, where you become immobilized. And here is where it gets complicated for the person at the party. Neuroception is not reading the room the way your rational mind reads it. Your rational mind looks around and sees friends, drinks, music, people having a good time. Your rational mind knows you are safe. But neuroception is picking up on different signals entirely. It is registering the unpredictable movement of bodies in a crowded space, the overlapping voices that drown out the prosodic cues your social engagement system needs to feel connected, the facial expressions of strangers whose intentions are unknown, the ambient noise level that triggers a stress response before you even realize you are stressed. Deb Dana, a clinician who has done extensive work translating Porges' theory into therapeutic practice, uses a phrase that captures this perfectly. She says that story follows state. What she means is that the narrative you construct about why you want to leave, the excuse about the headache or the early morning, that narrative comes after the nervous system shift, not before it. Your body moves into a sympathetic state, and then your mind creates a story to explain why your body feels the way it does. You do not decide to be anxious and then feel anxious. You feel anxious and then decide you must have a good reason. This is why it feels so confusing from the inside. Because, intellectually, that you are safe, that these are nice people, that nothing bad is going to happen, and yet your body is behaving as though something bad is already happening. The disconnect between what you know and what you feel is not a failure of logic. It is a feature of neuroception. Your body is running a threat detection program that was calibrated a long time ago, and it is using data from situations that bear no resemblance to a casual dinner party. But the nervous system does not make that distinction. Danger felt like this once. This feels like that. Time to go. Dan Siegel describes something called the window of tolerance, which is the zone of arousal where you can function well. Inside your window, you can think clearly, feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, engage with other people, and respond flexibly to what is happening around you. But when something pushes you outside that window, you either go up into hyperarousal, which is anxiety, restlessness, the urge to flee, or down into hypoarousal, which is numbness, dissociation, the fog of feeling nothing. Here is what matters about the window of tolerance for the person who leaves parties early. Trauma narrows the window. Significantly, what that means in practice is that someone with a history of developmental trauma, neglect, chaotic early environments, any of the things that shape the nervous system during its most plastic years, that person reaches overwhelm faster and from less stimulation than someone whose window is wide. A room that feels mildly stimulating to one person can feel catastrophically overstimulating to another, and neither person is wrong about their experience. They simply have different sized windows shaped by different histories. And when you are pushed outside your window, Siegel notes that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoning, planning, and social awareness, goes offline, which is why the decision to leave often feels abrupt, even to you. One moment you are managing, the next moment you are texting your excuse. There is no gradual decline you can point to and say, "This is where I started struggling." There is a threshold, and you crossed it. And by the time you realized what was happening, your body had already started moving toward the door. But the nervous system response does not explain everything, because there is another version of this person, the one who did not get overwhelmed at the party, the one who was never really there in the first place. This person planned their departure before they left the house. They calculated the minimum acceptable duration of attendance. They parked in a spot that would allow for easy exit. They might have even rehearsed the goodbye, the casual wave, the "I will catch up with you soon" that implies a future connection they have no intention of pursuing. This person showed up because something in them still responds to the pull of belonging. But they showed up with an escape plan because something else in them, something older and more practiced, knows that connection is where the danger lives. This is where attachment theory enters the conversation, and specifically the work that began with John Bowlby and continues to reshape our understanding of why adults relate the way they do. Bowlby introduced the concept of internal working models, which are essentially the mental blueprints for relationships that get built during your earliest interactions with caregivers. These models contain your expectations about other people, your beliefs about your own worthiness of love and attention, and your predictions about what happens when you need someone. And the critical thing about internal working models is that they operate largely outside of conscious awareness. You do not choose to believe that people will eventually disappoint you. The belief is already running, like background software, shaping your perceptions and your behavior without announcing itself. For the person with dismissive, avoidant attachment, the internal working model says something like this: "I am fine on my own. I do not need other people. Getting close to someone means getting hurt, so I will keep things light and manageable and always have one foot out the door." This model was built in childhood, usually in response to caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or dismissive of the child's needs. The child learned that reaching for connection resulted in nothing, or worse, in rejection. So the child adapted. They stopped reaching. They became self-sufficient. They learned to deactivate their attachment needs, to push down the longing for closeness and replace it with the appearance of independence. In adulthood, this shows up at parties as someone who seems perfectly social on the surface, easygoing, even charming. But the interactions stay shallow. The conversations never cross into anything vulnerable. There is a careful maintenance of distance, a positioning at the edge of the room, a preference for conversations that can be exited gracefully. What researchers call deactivating strategies, suppressing feelings of closeness when they arise, creating emotional barriers, focusing on others' flaws to justify distance, and always having an exit plan. What is happening beneath the surface is that when connection begins to deepen, when a conversation shifts from small talk to something real, the amygdala activates. The brain's threat detection center fires, interpreting intimacy as danger, and the person feels a sudden, often inexplicable urge to leave. They might not even recognize it as fear. It might register as boredom or restlessness, or the sudden conviction that they have somewhere else to be. But the underlying message from the nervous system is clear. This is getting too close. Time to go. Then there is the person with fearful avoidant attachment, which Mary Main identified as disorganized attachment in her research with children. And this is perhaps the most painful pattern of all, because it contains a fundamental contradiction. The person wants connection desperately. They crave belonging. They look at other people who seem to navigate social situations with ease, and they feel a longing so deep, it almost feels like grief. But they are simultaneously terrified of being truly seen, truly known, because their earliest experience of closeness was also their earliest experience of danger. This pattern develops when the primary caregiver is both the source of comfort and the source of fear. The child needs the caregiver for survival, but the caregiver is also unpredictable, frightening, or harmful. The child cannot resolve the paradox. You cannot run from the person you need to run to. And so the attachment system becomes disorganized, torn between approach and avoidance, unable to settle into either strategy. At a party, this looks like the person who arrives with genuine excitement, engages warmly, begins to feel something real in a conversation, and then abruptly shuts down. The warmth disappears. They become distant or agitated. They leave. And if you ask them afterward what happened, they might not be able to tell you, because what happened was not cognitive, it was somatic. The nervous system detected the beginning of attachment, and attachment for this person has always been fused with danger. The body responded the way it was trained to respond, by getting out. And this is where the two profiles merge. The person who gets overwhelmed and needs to escape, and the person who planned their exit before arriving, are running different versions of the same survival program. One is responding to real-time nervous system activation. The other is preempting it, but both are organized around the same core belief, written into the body before language, before memory, before conscious thought. Connection is not safe. Rooms full of people are not safe. And the safest thing to do is leave. But where did this belief come from? Let us go back to the room you grew up in. Not the party, the first room. The one that taught your nervous system everything it knows about what happens when people gather. Maybe it was a house where gatherings meant conflict, where holidays were minefields and family dinners could turn volatile without warning. Maybe it was a home where one parent's mood dictated the emotional weather for everyone, and you learned, before you could articulate the learning, to scan faces the way a sailor scans the sky. Not for enjoyment, for survival. You were watching for the tightening of a jaw, the shift in vocal tone, the silence that meant something was building. And you were good at it. You had to be. Researchers call this hypervigilance, and it begins as an adaptive response to an unpredictable environment. When the world around a child is chaotic, when safety is not guaranteed by the adults who are supposed to provide it, the brain's threat detection system calibrates itself to a permanent state of alertness. The reptilian survival center becomes hypersensitive. It stays on red alert, even after the original danger has passed, even decades later, even in rooms full of people who mean you no harm. Because the nervous system does not update automatically. It does not receive a memo informing it that the danger is over. It keeps running the program it was given, using the data it collected, until something intervenes to change it. In a party context, this means you walk into a room and immediately begin tracking. Not consciously, not deliberately, but your body is registering every shift in the conversational temperature. Every time someone's voice drops, your stomach tightens. Every burst of laughter makes you flinch, just barely, because loud sounds were once signals of something else entirely. You notice who is standing near the exit. You notice whose body language has changed. You notice the couple in the corner who might be having a tense exchange. And none of this is information you asked for. Your nervous system is gathering it compulsively because that is what it was trained to do. The room scanner cannot stop working because nobody ever gave the all-clear signal that would allow the scanning to stop. Or maybe your home was not chaotic. Maybe it was quiet. Maybe the problem was not what happened, but what did not happen. Childhood emotional neglect does not leave visible scars, and the adults who enact it often believe they are doing a perfectly adequate job because the child is fed, clothed, housed, and appears fine. But emotional neglect means the child's inner life, their fears, their excitement, their confusion, their need for comfort, goes consistently unmirrored. Nobody asks how you feel. Nobody notices when you are struggling. Nobody teaches you that your emotions are valid, worth naming, worth sharing with another person. What this produces is a particular kind of adult, someone who has learned that their internal experience does not matter to others, or worse, that expressing it will result in being ignored, dismissed, or subtly punished for creating inconvenience. At a party, this person performs sociality beautifully. They ask questions. They listen attentively. They are the one everyone describes as such a good listener. But they never share anything real about themselves because deep down they have internalized the belief that their real self is not interesting enough, not important enough, not worth anyone's time. And the performance is exhausting. Not because they do not care about the people they are talking to, but because every interaction requires them to suppress their own experience while attending to someone else's. They are still doing what they did as a child, managing the emotional environment, making sure everyone else is comfortable, disappearing. Carl Rogers described something he called conditions of worth. And it is one of the most quietly devastating concepts in psychology. What Rogers observed is that children develop their sense of self through the reactions of the people around them. When a child receives unconditional positive regard, which means acceptance and warmth that does not depend on behaving in particular ways, the child develops a sense of self that feels stable, integrated, authentic. But when regard is conditional, when the message is, "I love you when you are quiet, when you are helpful, when you do not make a fuss, when you perform well," the child learns that their authentic self is not acceptable. They begin to construct what Rogers called a self-concept built on the conditions that earned them love, and they experience what he termed incongruence, a persistent gap between who they actually are and who they believe they need to be in order to deserve connection. At a party, incongruence feels like wearing a costume you cannot take off. You are performing the version of yourself that you believe will be acceptable, but the performance requires constant monitoring. Am I being interesting enough? Am I laughing at the right things? Am I talking too much or not enough? Every interaction becomes a test, and the grading criteria are invisible, based on rules you internalized before you were old enough to question them. And the exhaustion of this performance is what eventually drives you out the door. Not because the party is bad, but because being a version of yourself that is not actually you requires an enormous amount of energy, and you run out. Donald Winnicott called this the false self, and he described it as a protective adaptation that develops when the child's environment does not allow for authentic expression. The false self is compliant, performative, and socially skilled, but it carries a hidden cost. The person feels phony despite outward success. They lack spontaneity. They feel hollow or dead inside, even in moments that should feel alive. At gatherings, the false self manages the interaction, while the true self sits somewhere deeper, watching, waiting, wanting to be seen, but terrified of what would happen if it actually was. There is also a pattern worth naming that has to do with where you grew up in the family system. Parentification is the term for what happens when a child is placed in the role of caretaker, either instrumentally performing household tasks and responsibilities that belong to the adults, or emotionally managing the emotional lives of the parents, mediating conflicts, being the confidant for adult problems, becoming the peacemaker. Salvador Minuchin first described this pattern, and Gregory Jerkovich later explored its lasting impact in what he called lost childhoods. The parentified child develops extraordinary social skills. They are perceptive, attuned, responsive to others' needs, and skilled at reading emotional undercurrents. These are gifts, in a sense, but they were forged under duress. The child did not develop these capacities out of curiosity or natural talent. They developed them because survival demanded it. Someone had to manage the household. Someone had to absorb the parents' distress. Someone had to make sure the emotional temperature of the room stayed within a range that prevented catastrophe. And that someone was a child who should have been playing or learning or being taken care of themselves. In adulthood, this person walks into a party and immediately begins doing what they always did, scanning the room for who needs what, noticing who seems uncomfortable, and gravitating toward them, not to connect but to fix, filling awkward silences, smoothing over tense moments, managing the emotional atmosphere the way a thermostat manages temperature. And they are exhausted before the first hour is over because they are doing a job they have been doing since they were 6 years old, a job that was never theirs to do, a job they cannot stop doing because it is wired so deeply into their sense of self that they do not know who they are without it. Even Bosomenyi Nagy described something he called invisible loyalties, which are the unconscious debts and obligations that bind family members across generations. The parentified child carries an invisible loyalty to the role they played, even when they recognize intellectually that they are no longer responsible for managing everyone's emotions. Their body continues to perform the function. At parties, this creates a particular agony. They are simultaneously desperate to rest and incapable of resting, because resting means abandoning the post they have manned since childhood. The only way to rest is to leave, and so they leave, not because the party is overwhelming in the conventional sense, but because the labor of being the invisible emotional caretaker in a room full of adults is a weight their body can no longer sustain. Murray Bowen introduced the concept of differentiation of self, which describes the ability to maintain your own sense of identity while remaining connected to others. People with low differentiation have difficulty separating their own emotional experience from the emotional experience of those around them. They absorb others' anxiety. They feel responsible for others' happiness. They lose themselves in the emotional field of the group. High differentiation, by contrast, means the ability to be present in a room full of people and remain in contact with your own internal experience without being swallowed by the collective emotional weather. The person who leaves parties early often has low differentiation, not because they are weak or undeveloped, but because the family system they grew up in never allowed them to practice separating their experience from everyone else's. They were needed as an emotional sponge. Their job was to absorb, to contain, to regulate, and that job followed them out of the family home and into every social gathering they have attended since. What makes this particular pattern so difficult to change is that the person often receives enormous social reinforcement for it. They are the thoughtful one, the good listener, the one everyone calls when they need help. Their identity is built around being useful, being attuned, being available. The exhaustion they feel after social events gets reframed as just being an introvert, rather than what it actually is, which is the cumulative toll of performing a role that was never supposed to be theirs. Gabor Mate has written extensively about the connection between early childhood adaptation and adult health. He argues that when children must suppress their authentic needs in order to maintain attachment with caregivers, the suppression does not simply disappear in adulthood. It goes underground. It becomes the background hum of a life organized around others' needs, and it emerges eventually as chronic stress, as autoimmune conditions, as the bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seems to fix. The person who leaves the party early may be experiencing, in microcosm, the same dynamic that shapes their entire life, the body reaching its limit of self-suppression and insisting, through discomfort, through agitation, through the overwhelming need to get out, that something has to give. And then there is the fawn response, a term introduced by Pete Walker that describes a particular flavor of trauma survival, Walker added fawning to the traditional fight, flight, and freeze framework, and it describes the person who manages perceived threats by merging with the needs and wishes of others. Fawning is not generosity. It is not kindness. It is a survival strategy that operates on the unconscious belief that the price of admission to any relationship is the complete forfeiture of your own needs, preferences, and boundaries. At a party, the fawner is the person who shapeshifts. They match the energy of whoever they are talking to. They agree with opinions they do not hold. They laugh at jokes that are not funny to them. They offer to help in the kitchen, to get someone a drink, to take care of something that nobody asked them to take care of. And they do all of this not because they enjoy it, but because their nervous system has learned that usefulness equals safety, that being needed equals being kept, that the moment you stop performing your utility, you become disposable. Walker also describes something called emotional flashbacks, and this concept is essential for understanding what is actually happening when someone abruptly leaves a social gathering. An emotional flashback is a sudden regression to the feeling states of childhood, but unlike a traditional flashback, it does not come with visual memories. There is no cinematic replay of a specific event. Instead, what floods in is the emotional texture of being a child who felt small, afraid, defective, and alone. And because there is no visual component, the person does not realize they are having a flashback. They just suddenly feel terrible, and they attach that feeling to whatever is happening in the present moment. So someone at a party hears a dismissive tone in a stranger's voice, and without any conscious awareness of the connection, they are suddenly 7 years old again, standing in a living room where that tone meant something was about to go wrong. The adult mind does not register the time travel. The adult mind just registers a crushing desire to leave, a sudden conviction that they do not belong here, that they were foolish to come, that nobody really wants them here anyway. And they grab their coat, they text their excuse, they get in the car and feel the relief wash over them, still not understanding that what they just escaped was not the party but a memory. Now let us talk about what is happening in your body during all of this, because the body is where the story actually lives. Bessel van der Kolk spent decades researching how trauma reshapes the brain and the body. His central finding is that traumatic experiences do not just create bad memories. They alter the structure and function of the brain itself. They change the way the body processes sensation, the way the nervous system regulates arousal, the way a person inhabits their own physical form. And these changes persist long after the original traumatic events have ended. The body, as van der Kolk puts it, keeps the score. In a social setting, this means that the person with developmental trauma is not just thinking differently than the person without it. They are feeling differently at a physiological level in ways that cannot be overridden by willpower or positive thinking. Their amygdala, the brain's alarm system, is more reactive. Their cortisol levels may be chronically elevated. Their body holds tension in patterns that reflect old defensive postures. The shoulders pulled up toward the ears, the jaw clenched, the belly tight, and all of this happens automatically, without permission, without negotiation. Peter Levine, the developer of Somatic Experiencing, noticed something critical about how animals process threat. Wild animals face life-threatening situations routinely: predator attacks, territorial conflicts, near misses of every variety. But they do not develop chronic trauma symptoms. The reason, Levine observed, is that after the threat passes, the animal's body discharges the survival energy through involuntary shaking, trembling, and movement. The threat response completes itself. The energy moves through the body and is released, and the animal returns to baseline. Humans, by contrast, suppress this discharge. We hold it together. We stay composed. We muscle through, and the survival energy that would have been released through that trembling, that shaking, that primal completion of the defensive response gets trapped in the nervous system. It stays in the body as chronic tension, as heightened arousal, as a nervous system that never fully returns to rest. And in a room full of people, subtle triggers, a tone of voice, a particular quality of laughter, the sensation of being watched can reactivate that trapped energy without any conscious awareness of what is happening. Muscles tighten, heart rate spikes, breathing becomes shallow. The body is preparing for a threat that exists not in the present moment, but in the unfinished business of the past. Levine uses the term felt sense to describe the body's total experience at any given moment. It is not an emotion, exactly, and it is not a thought. It is something more fundamental than either. The felt sense at a party for someone with a trauma history might be a wordless tightness, an unnameable dread, a pulling sensation toward the door that has no story attached to it, no narrative, no explanation, just a body-level certainty that something is wrong and that leaving will make it better. And in a way, leaving does make it better. Immediately, when you walk out of a party and get into your car and close the door, there is a moment. You know this moment. The noise disappears, the pressure drops, your shoulders come down from wherever they have been hiding near your ears. Your breathing slows. Something in your chest unlocks, and for a few seconds, or maybe minutes, you feel a relief so profound it almost justifies everything that came before it. The nervousness, the performance, the awkward goodbye, all of it seems like a reasonable price for this feeling of finally being alone, finally being safe, finally being released from whatever was happening in that room. What you are experiencing in that moment is the nervous system completing its charge and discharge cycle. The removal of what your body perceived as threat cues, the noise, the crowding, the unpredictability, allows the vagal brake to re-engage. Heart rate declines, breathing deepens. The muscles that were braced for danger begin to soften. Pendulation, which is Levine's term for the natural oscillation between contraction and expansion, between stress and release, finally has room to complete itself. The relief you feel is not just psychological, it is neurological. Your body is returning to a state it could not access while you were in the room. But here is the thing about that relief. It is also a signal. It is your body telling you that for the duration of the gathering, you were in a state of threat response, not just discomfort, not just mild preference for quiet, actual physiological threat response. The fact that leaving produces such dramatic relief means that your nervous system was working very hard for the entire time you were there to manage a level of activation that it experienced as dangerous. That is not the same as being an introvert who prefers quiet evenings. That is a nervous system on high alert that has finally been granted permission to stand down. And then comes what you might recognize as the social hangover. The hours or sometimes days after a gathering, where you feel drained in a way that seems disproportionate to what actually happened. You did not run a marathon, you went to a dinner party. But the exhaustion is real, and it reflects the enormous metabolic cost of sustained hypervigilance, sustained masking, sustained fawning, or all three at once. Your body spent the evening doing the equivalent of running from a predator while simultaneously smiling and making small talk. Of course you are tired, and there is what happens after, not just the exhaustion, but the processing, the replaying. You lie in bed and run the conversations back, checking them for errors the way a quality control inspector checks a production line. Did you talk too much about yourself? Did you seem awkward when you said goodbye? Did anyone notice you were looking at your phone? Did the host seem offended when you left? The replaying can go on for hours, sometimes days, and it is not neutral analysis. It is a prosecution. You are the defendant, the prosecutor, and the jury, and the verdict is almost always guilty. Guilty of being too much, guilty of not being enough, guilty of failing once again at something that appears to come effortlessly to everyone else. And then, perhaps, you see the photos. Someone posts pictures from later in the evening, after you left, and the people in those photos are laughing, arms around each other, clearly having the kind of time you wanted to be having. And you feel something land in your chest, heavy and familiar. You were not there for that part. You missed it, again. And the voice that narrates your social life adds another entry to its running catalogue of evidence that you are not built for this, that other people have a capacity you lack, that the leaving is just who you are. But that voice is narrating from incomplete data. It does not account for the nervous system that was already activated before you walked through the door. It does not factor in the decades of survival programming that made every crowded room feel like a threat assessment exercise. It does not consider that the capacity you see in others might simply be a wider window of tolerance, built by a different childhood, calibrated by different early data. The voice presents the leaving as a character flaw when it is actually a biological event, a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do in response to cues that your conscious mind does not even register. This is where the shame turns. Not away exactly, but into something more useful. Because once you understand that the leaving is not a choice in the way you always believed it was, once you see it as your body executing a program rather than your personality failing a test, the whole thing shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the shame loses some of its grip. Because shame requires a story about deficiency, and the true story is not about deficiency at all. It is about adaptation, about a nervous system that got very, very good at keeping you safe in rooms where safety was not guaranteed. But there is another layer to the leaving, and it is the one that people talk about least. Because sometimes you leave not when things feel bad, but when things feel good. Gay Hendricks introduced a concept called the upper limit problem, and it describes an internal thermostat for how much positive experience you allow yourself to have. Hendricks observed that we each carry an unconscious ceiling on how much joy, success, love, and connection we believe we deserve. And when positive experience exceeds that ceiling, we self-sabotage, we create conflict, we get anxious, we we find a reason to leave, not because the situation is threatening in any obvious way, but because the goodness itself feels threatening, because it exceeds what our nervous system has been calibrated to tolerate. Think about the last time you were at a gathering and actually having a good time, a real conversation, a genuine laugh, the feeling of being seen by someone and liking what they saw. And then, seemingly from nowhere, the restlessness arrived, the sudden urge to check the time, the thought that you should probably get going, the vague, rootless anxiety that has no name and no object, but makes staying feel impossible. What happened in that moment was not that the party changed. What happened was that you hit your upper limit for connection. The warmth, the openness, the vulnerability of being genuinely present with another person exceeded the amount of closeness your system has been trained to tolerate. And so, the thermostat kicked in, flooding your body with the same restlessness and discomfort that you would feel in a genuinely unpleasant situation. Because at the level of the nervous system, too much love and too much danger can feel exactly the same. Hendricks identifies 4 unconscious fears that set this thermostat. The belief that you are fundamentally flawed and undeserving. The fear that success or connection will threaten important relationships. The belief that more happiness means more burden. And the fear that shining fully will make others feel bad. Any one of these can trigger the upper limit response, and they were all installed in childhood, during the years when your nervous system was building its model of how much goodness is sustainable before something goes wrong. And this is the cruelest part of the pattern, because the person who leaves when things get bad and the person who leaves when things get good are trapped in the same loop. One direction says, I am overwhelmed and I need to escape. The other direction says, I am getting too close and I need to retreat. Both directions lead to the same place, alone in the car, relieved. And then, after the relief fades, something that feels like sadness, or maybe shame, or maybe just the quiet recognition that you did it again. Now, there is a question that hovers over all of this, and it is one worth confronting honestly. Where does introversion end and trauma adaptation begin? Because the label introvert has become a kind of sanctuary for people who leave early. It provides a socially acceptable explanation that does not require examination. I am just an introvert. I recharge alone. I prefer small groups. These are things that sound like self-knowledge, and sometimes they are. Genuine introversion exists as a temperamental trait with significant genetic contribution. Introverts process stimulation differently. They find social interaction draining, but not frightening. They prefer depth over breadth in relationships. They can enjoy a party on their own terms. But trauma-driven social avoidance looks almost identical from the outside. And the distinction matters. Because introversion is a preference. It feels clean, uncomplicated, comfortable. But avoidance driven by developmental trauma is not a preference. It is a cage that looks like a choice. It is organized around fear, not comfort, around the prediction of danger, not the enjoyment of solitude. The person operating from trauma does not leave the party because they would genuinely rather be reading a book at home. They leave because their body has decided the room is dangerous, and the story about preferring solitude is a narrative their mind constructed after the fact to make the exit feel like agency rather than compulsion. The distinction can be felt from the inside if you are willing to look closely. After a genuine introvert leaves a party, they feel satisfied, content, pleasantly tired. After someone operating from a trauma response leaves a party, they feel relieved, which is a very different thing. Relief implies the removal of distress, not the presence of contentment. And often, underneath the relief, there is a flavor of grief, a wish that it could have been different, a longing to be the person who stays. The identity that forms around being the one who always leaves early serves a protective function. It provides a consistent, predictable self-concept in a world that once felt anything but predictable. It prevents the vulnerability of admitting that you leave not because you want to, but because something in you is afraid. And it becomes self-reinforcing, because every time you leave early and feel relief, the nervous system logs another data point confirming that leaving is the correct strategy. The pattern deepens. The exit becomes faster. The excuses become more automatic, and the window for staying, for tolerating the discomfort of connection long enough to discover that it might not destroy you, gets narrower. So where does this leave you? Not the theoretical you, not the clinical case study you, but you, the person who just left another party and is sitting in the driveway with the engine running, feeling that familiar mix of relief and something heavier. It leaves you at a choice point. But the choice is not the one you think it is. The choice is not force yourself to stay at parties. That would be asking a dysregulated nervous system to white-knuckle through an experience it perceives as threatening. And white-knuckling is not healing. It is endurance. And endurance without safety does not rewire anything. It just adds another layer of distress to an already burdened system. The actual choice, the one that leads somewhere different, has a much quieter name. Peter Levine calls it titration. Titration is the practice of approaching difficult experiences in the smallest manageable dose. Not flooding yourself with the thing you fear, but touching the edge of it, gently, briefly, and then returning to safety. It is the difference between jumping into the deep end, which can reinforce the trauma, and lowering yourself into the pool 1 inch at a time, allowing your body to adjust, to learn that the water is not going to kill you. A little bit at a time. A little bit, slowly. What titration looks like in practice is showing up at a gathering with a genuine plan for leaving, not as an escape strategy, but as a container. You give yourself full permission to leave at any point, which paradoxically reduces the urgency to flee, because the exit is not something you have to fight for. It is already guaranteed. And within that container of permission, you experiment with staying just slightly longer than comfortable. 5 minutes past the point where the restlessness arrives. 10 minutes past the moment you reach for your phone. Not hours, minutes. Because the nervous system does not learn in leaps. It learns in increments so small they are almost invisible, but they accumulate. Levine also describes a process called pendulation, which is the natural rhythm of the nervous system moving between activation and settling, between contraction and expansion. In a healthy nervous system, pendulation happens fluidly. You encounter something stimulating, your arousal rises, and then it falls again as the system self-regulates. But in a traumatized nervous system, the pendulation gets stuck. The person gets activated and cannot come back down, or they collapse into shutdown and cannot come back up. What titration does is restore the natural swing of the pendulum. You approach the edge of activation. You feel the body begin to mobilize, and then you step back. You let the system settle, and then you approach again. Each time, the swing gets a little wider, the window opens a little more, and the body begins to learn through direct experience rather than cognitive understanding that activation does not have to end in overwhelm, that it is possible to feel the discomfort and still be okay. This is different from forcing yourself to stay at a party through sheer willpower. Willpower operates from the top down, the cognitive mind overriding the body's distress signals. Titration operates from the bottom up, working with the body rather than against it, respecting its pace, honoring its limits, and gradually, patiently expanding what it can tolerate. There is another concept that matters here, and it comes from a much older tradition in psychotherapy. Franz Alexander coined the term corrective emotional experience to describe a moment in therapy where the client's expectation of how a relationship will go is contradicted by what actually happens. The client expects rejection and receives acceptance. The client expects judgment and receives curiosity. The client expects abandonment and receives consistency. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something shifts. Not in the mind, exactly, but in the body. The nervous system receives new data that does not match its predictions. And if the experience is repeated enough times, the predictions begin to update. Corrective emotional experiences can happen in therapy, but they can also happen at parties. The moment when you share something slightly vulnerable and the other person leans in rather than pulling away. The moment when you admit you are feeling overwhelmed and someone says, "Me too," and means it. The moment when you stay 5 minutes longer than usual and nothing bad happens and your body registers this quietly as new information. These moments are small. They do not feel dramatic or transformative in the instant they occur, but they accumulate and they provide the nervous system with evidence that its old predictions, built in childhood, in rooms that were genuinely dangerous, may not apply to every room it enters for the rest of your life. Deb Dana offers a practical entry point through what she calls glimmers. Glimmers are micro moments of ventral vagal activation, tiny sparks of safety and connection that the nervous system can use as anchors. The warmth of a genuine smile directed at you, the sound of a specific person's laughter, the feeling of standing near a window where you can see outside, the comfort of holding a warm drink. These are not grand gestures. They are sensory cues that tell the nervous system, even briefly, that safety exists in this room. And learning to notice them, to orient toward them rather than toward threat cues, begins to shift the ratio of danger to safety in the body's ongoing assessment. Dana also suggests identifying what she calls anchors, which are the specific people, places, sensations, and activities that reliably activate the ventral vagal state. Knowing your anchors means knowing what you can reach for when neuroception starts to shift. Maybe it is a specific friend whose presence makes you feel calm. Maybe it is standing in a particular spot in the room. Maybe it is the act of stepping outside for 30 seconds, not to leave, but to let your nervous system recalibrate, and then walking back in. These are not tricks. They are nervous system resourcing, And they work because they address the body directly rather than trying to think your way into a different state. The neuroscience behind all of this is genuinely encouraging, even though the process is slow. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to form new neural pathways and reorganize existing ones, does not stop in childhood. It continues throughout the lifespan. Attachment patterns, which were once believed to be fixed by early experience, can shift with awareness, practice, and relational experience. The internal working models that Bowlby described are not written in stone. They are written in neural pathways that can be modified gradually by new experiences that contradict old expectations. Our earliest relationships build the brain structures we use for relating throughout our lives, but those structures remain capable of updating. What was learned in relationship can be relearned in relationship. But, and this is important, the learning is not cognitive. You cannot think your way into a wider window of tolerance. You cannot read your way into secure attachment. You cannot understand your way out of a trauma response. The body does not take orders from the intellect. It takes orders from experience, which means that healing happens not through insight alone, but through repeated, embodied experiences of safety in the presence of others. The body learns what the mind cannot teach it, and it learns slowly at its own pace, through direct contact with what it fears. This is why the advice to just put yourself out there misses the point so completely. Because putting yourself out there without nervous system resourcing, without titration, without attention to the body's actual experience, is just flooding. And flooding reinforces the belief that connection is overwhelming. What works is something far less dramatic and far more patient. It is showing up with awareness, noticing when your nervous system shifts, having compassion for the shift rather than judgment, staying 5 minutes longer when it feels possible, and leaving without shame when it does not, and doing this again and again, not with the goal of becoming a different person, but with the openness to discovering that you might have more capacity than your nervous system currently believes. There is a version of this story that ends with you staying at the party all night, dancing, laughing, being the last one there. And maybe that version is possible for you. Maybe one day your window of tolerance will be wide enough that a crowded room feels stimulating rather than threatening, that the noise feels like aliveness rather than chaos, that the vulnerability of being known feels like intimacy rather than exposure. But maybe that is not the version that matters. Maybe what matters is a version that is much less cinematic, the version where you go to a party and notice the moment your hand reaches for your phone, and instead of checking it, you take a breath. The version where you feel the tightness in your chest and name it silently as activation rather than as evidence that you need to leave. The version where you stay 15 minutes longer than last time, not because you forced yourself, but because something in you was curious about what would happen if you did. And when you eventually leave, because you do leave, you leave without the shame spiral, without the "what is wrong with me?" without the silent promise to yourself that next time will be different, which is really just another form of self-punishment. Maybe the version that matters is the one where you leave the party and sit in your car, and instead of feeling ashamed, you feel something like tenderness toward the person who showed up even though their body was screaming not to, toward the nervous system that is still running a program from decades ago because nobody ever told it the danger has passed, toward the child who learned in a room that was nothing like this party, but that taught your body everything it knows about rooms, that the safest thing to do is leave. Your nervous system does not believe yet that staying is safe. It has years of data suggesting otherwise. And data collected in childhood, when the brain is at its most plastic and the stakes are highest, carries enormous weight. Overwriting that data is not a weekend project. It is not a matter of willpower or positive affirmations or forcing yourself through enough uncomfortable social situations that you eventually stop feeling uncomfortable. It is the slow, patient, sometimes frustrating work of giving your body new experiences that your mind cannot provide on its own. Experiences of being seen and not rejected, of being vulnerable and not punished, of being present in a room full of people and discovering, one moment at a time, that you survived it, not by leaving, by staying. And maybe the next party is not the one where everything changes. Maybe you still check your phone at the 40-minute mark. Maybe you still feel the tightness and the scanning and the quiet calculation of how long until you can reasonably go. But maybe this time you also notice a glimmer, a moment of real laughter, a conversation that touches something genuine, a flash of what it might feel like to belong somewhere, not because you performed your way in, but because you were simply there, simply yourself. And it was enough. That flash will not last. It does not need to. Your nervous system registers it anyway, and somewhere in the architecture of your brain, in the neural pathways that have been running the same program since you were small enough to be carried out of rooms you could not leave on your own, a new possibility gets filed, not as a belief, not as a thought, but as a felt sense, a body-level whisper that says, maybe this room is different, maybe these people are safe, maybe I can stay a little longer and find out. You are not broken for wanting to leave. You were built carefully and intelligently by a nervous system that was trying to keep you alive in conditions that required exactly this kind of vigilance. The leaving was a gift once. It was the smartest thing your body knew how to do. And honoring that, understanding that every early exit was an act of self-preservation rather than a personal failure, is not a small thing. It is the beginning of a different kind of relationship with yourself. One where the question is not, why can I not just be normal? But what did my body learn? And what might it be ready to learn now? The party will still be there. The invitations will still come. And you will still feel every time that familiar negotiation between the part of you that wants to go and the part that wants to stay home. Between the part that walks in the door and the part that is already planning the exit, but knowing what you now know about neuroception and attachment and the window of tolerance and the way the body keeps its own kind of score. You are not the same person who walked into this conversation. You have a map now, not a cure, not a fix, a map. And maps do not get you anywhere on their own, but they change the nature of the journey from wandering to walking with intention, even when the path is slow, even when the destination is uncertain, even when the most you can manage today is 5 minutes more than yesterday. That is enough. Your nervous system is listening,